It is 1861. Abraham Lincoln has been elected President of the United States. One of the goals of his party, the Republican Party, is to end slavery. As a result of Lincoln's election, many southern states have begun seceding from the Union to form their own nation. Many Southerners in the U.S. Congress, such as James C. Chestnut, have resigned from their offices. They have left Washington, D.C. to return home.
When a state secedes, it decides it would be better off running its own affairs rather than being part of the United States. In the case of the southern states, they thought that the North, which was industrial, didn't understand the agricultural way of the South. The South felt the North was imposing rules that would hurt their economy and culture. Much of the talk in both the North and South was about what would happen between the two sides.
Lincoln, you know, despite his appearance, is the cleverest Yankee type there is. Ugly as sin, you know, always sitting on boxes at the country store, telling the most awful, the funniest stories, and whittling away with a knife.
Mr. Douglas of Illinois confided to my husband that Lincoln was the hardest man to handle he'd ever met. And Lincoln surely did hammer Mr. Douglas into the ground during the debates.
Mark my words, if this country's to be joked and laughed, then Lincoln's the man to do it. Let's just see if there is a war, and Yankee pockets get pinched instead of filled.
Northerners are no more mean and stingy than Southerners, sir.
My apologies, of course, ma'am. You're quite correct. Northerners and Southerners share the same vices and virtues.
We will try to make war based on Mr. Lincoln's appearance, but that will not do. We know what this is all about. Slavery, pure and simple.
On the contrary, there's nothing simple about it. Think of the North and South as having different temperaments. We are incompatible in so many ways. Climate, economy, geography, society. We must divorce each other. But let's not fight about it. Let us go our own separate ways and say no more.
I hold my tongue, Mrs. Chestnut. You know that I do. But what am I, a northern woman, to do if I am attacked? Why, just this morning, I was playing Yankee Doodle on the piano, and the judge came in and asked if I were to leave out the Yankee while I played the Doodle.
We are terrible. Poor woman, if I were up north, I would expect them to argue against the South, and I would hold my tongue.
You were until quite recently in the North, Mrs. Chestnut, as was I, until our husbands resigned from Congress. As I recall, you did not always hold your tongue.
No, but I knew that I should, and I felt quite sorry about it.
You are quite right about Northern and Southern temperance. Heading the Confederate Army as general would have suited my husband so much better than being president of the Confederacy. People are so hard to please. You should have seen his face when he received the telegram telling him that he had been elected. You would have thought his best friend had died.
Still, it may not come to war, you know.
It may not, but if it's sure the South is right.
Are we?
Tonight, we talked of ourselves in the North. We only want to separate from them.
And yet, they put such an inordinate value on us, they are willing to risk all. I think incompatibility of temper began when it was made plain to us that we get all the problems of slavery, and they all the money through their factories. We would only be too grateful to be left alone.
When the southern states seceded from the Union, they took control of the forts and governmental properties within their borders. Fort Sumter, however, lying in Charleston Harbor, was still occupied by the U.S. troops. One of Lincoln's first moves as president was to resupply Fort Sumter with fresh ammunition, weapons, and supplies. James C. Chestnut, a provisional member of the Confederate government, began to prepare for war.
Lincoln isn't done arming the fort. He's sending in fresh soldiers and supplies. It's clearly an act of war. Certainly Mr. Lincoln will listen to reason. He hasn't yet. The War Council is meeting this evening to decide how to respond. Lawrence, my hat! James, do you see any way this war can be avoided? No, my dear, I don't. Send word to me, James, about what you decide. I would rather know than sit here and wonder. I will. Lawrence!
Lawrence, Master Jim's calling for his hat. Can't you hear him?
If it's his hat, then he should be able to find it.
What are you talking this nonsense for?
It's not nonsense, it's the truth.
You want to be free, is that it? What would you do? Where would you go?
You forget. Miss Mary taught me how to read. I guess I can take care of myself, all right? Haven't I taken care of Master Jim all these years?
I've heard enough. Find that hat and take Miss Mary her tea.
Thank you. Lawrence, Mr. Lincoln has sent out 6 men of war to sit in our harbor. It appears we're headed for war.
Yes, ma'am?
Maria, is anything wrong with Lawrence? He's gotten awfully quiet.
He should never have learned how to read.
Maria! How could you say such a thing?
Because now he spends all his time reading the newspapers about Mr. Lincoln and your friend Mr. Davis, about the war that's coming, and his mind is filled with thoughts like things are going to change.
Things are going to change, Maria. Don't you know that? No matter how this war ends, you'll be free. Before the war is over, we'll have to free you.
And then what? Has anybody thought about that?
Later that night, Mary again wrote in her diary.
Not by one word or look can we detect any change in the demeanor of these Negro servants. Lawrence sits at the door, as sleepy and as respectful and as profoundly indifferent. So are they all. They carry it too far. You could not tell they hear anything, and people talk before them as if they were chairs and tables, and they make no sign.
What's going on at the fort? What has James told you? Are we at war yet?
Julia, we are not at war.
Not yet, Mary. Come now, your husband is the head of the army in South Carolina. I know the War Council met last night. You must have some news.
I can't think James knows anything that your husband doesn't. Isn't Mr. Toombs still the Confederacy's Secretary of State?
Mary, you're no fun at all. Don't you think this is the most exciting thing?
I've heard enough of this reckless, devil-may-care, headstrong thinking. If we were to go to war, we must prepare for it. We must develop some patience and persistence. We have enough and too much of this pluck and dash.
Mary Chestnut, you're nothing but a black ball of gloom today.
I want us to be free of the North as much as anyone. What I cannot understand is why they just will not let us go our own way. I cannot understand how our men can believe that all they have to do is stand in a line and fire their guns, and the Yankees will turn and run away. Don't they know the North is as convinced they're right as we're certain we're right?
We are right. The North is wrong.
This whole disagreement has come about because the South has all the problems of slavery, while the North makes all the money off the products of the slaves.
Good heavens, what would you have us do? Give up our slaves? Ship them north?
Julia Toombs, sometimes you try my patience. Listen to me. When the cotton gets milled, where does it go? To the north, to the factories, where it's made into curtains and clothes and bedspreads and sails for ships. When the items are sold, who gets the money? The factory owners up north. We have to use slaves to pick the cotton that the North needs. Now, don't you think that reasonable men can sit around a table and find an agreement that benefits both sides?
It's not a question of money, Mary. The Constitution says that each state can act at its own right. The North wants to outlaw slavery in the southern states. They cannot do it. They have no right to do it.
Ah, Julia, that stubborn streak may be the undoing of the South.
At midnight, James C. Chestnut and other Confederate officers rode out to Fort Sumter. They told Major Robert Anderson that if he didn't surrender the fort by 4 o'clock a.m., the Confederate soldiers would start firing.
Mary Chestnut lay in bed. She heard a church clock chiming 4 bells. 30 minutes later, she saw flashes of light from her window and heard explosions. Like everyone else in Charleston, she rushed up to her roof.
Oh, Mary, isn't it magnificent?
It might be if my husband were somewhere in a boat in the harbor.
Look, it's only Confederate fire. Fort Sumter's not shooting back. He's perfectly safe. Look how the shells light up in the sky. You should hear the baby. He claps his hands and says boom boom every time he hears an explosion.
And who knows what death and destruction each one brings. Oh, James, I hope you're safe.
The shelling of Fort Sumter lasted for 34 hours. Then finally, on April 13th, the shelling stopped and the Confederate flag flew over the fort.
Wigfall and I were on Morris Island when...
"The fort's on fire!" I shouted, and hopped in a boat waving my white handkerchief like mad so I wouldn't get shot.
Then we climbed in through a porthole.
You saw that, didn't you?
Did you have to climb through a porthole too, James?
Fortunately, Colonel Anderson received me at the entrance, very gentlemanly. He did mention that the fort was mine and that we should choose our steps carefully.
Mine? And I was worried about all those shells falling on you in the bay.
I must go. Have to spread the word. Everyone wants to hear about the surrender, and the fort surrendered to me, after all.
Did Major Anderson really surrender to him?
He did indeed. I think the sight of him going through the porthole scared me more than anything.
I don't imagine any battles to come will be as amusing as this one was. Or as victorious. No human lives lost.
Did you know that Major Anderson was Beauregard's teacher at West Point? Can you imagine Beauregard giving the order to open fire on the man who taught him to be a gunner? He gave the American flag to Anderson.
There are no clean divisions in this war. If only it were as simple as North versus South, or slavery versus freedom.
Old Abe has given us no choice. We've proven that we won't turn from a fight.
Is there no hope at all for negotiation?
None. None at all.
Later that night, Mary again wrote her diary.